Marvel Snap's newest OTA just dropped, and this one looks big. For the last 6 months, Marvel Snap has been ruled by cards that duplicate other cards, to the point that I made a video talking about how they needed to dial it back on synergy creep. This was a little bit before they released Mother Askani, who unfortunately, to my mind, took synergy creep to another level. Mother Askani's best use cases in the current metagame are copying Gambit Horseman of Death and copying pretty much anything in the Captain Carter combo deck. Since she released, those two decks have been among the best, if not the best decks in the entire game, especially at high levels of infinite play. This is a big nerf to Mother Askani. Yes, she's gaining a point of power, but she's losing far, far more than that. The way she works now is, instead of giving her buff of -1 cost and +2 power to the base card and then making a copy, the base card does not get any buffs at all. So at baseline, they took 2 power out of this card and a -1 cost. Only the copied card is now getting the buffs, but that also stops you from multiplying it. One of the notable things about Mother Askani is she was a card that scaled very well with copying herself. So for example, you would play Mother Askani and then play Grandmaster. This would give you not just your first Mother Askani proc, but an intensified copy of the second Mother Askani proc, because the first Mother Askani proc had applied to the card that you are copying. This is no longer on the table, and it was the sort of core of her most powerful interactions. The big question for me is what this does to the decks that relied on her. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen over the last 6 months a Grandmaster deck, a Maverick deck, those type of things being the things that are dominant with things that are good to repeat. We've seen that with Mother Askani in terms of Grandmaster, and we've seen that with Star-Lord in terms of Grandmaster, where Maverick and Mother Askani overlap. Maverick and Sholau have previously overlapped. The big question is, will it remain doing this? Because it's possible that just copying things is good enough that the best copier is always going to be something that shows up, and that it's also possible that this might still be the best copier even though it's no longer doing half of the stuff that it used to do. More than half, honestly. This is a really big nerf, but the pool of copiers is actually not that large and contains a lot of cards that actually aren't that good. So it's very possible that Mother Askani remains the best of them, even though it is a much less broken, much less oppressive card than it otherwise would have been. I will say this, I think that it's very possible that the combination of Mother Askani and Storm Horseman of Famine in the Captain Carter decks were sort of feeding into each other. Mother Askani was a way to get the volume of cards on the board after a Storm Horseman of Famine, thanks to the way she could stack her discounts and apply them. That might not be true anymore, and I would be questioning whether or not we are positive about the way we're building the Carter combo decks in the future. I don't think we are. I think we might be changing a few things up. That said, I still expect her to be a powerful card with Gambit Horseman of Death, and I also expect a lot of the reaction out of this patch to be, why didn't they nerf Gambit Horseman of Death? I think part of it is that Mother Askani is a better card, but I still think that Gambit Horseman of Death would at least be a reasonable pull for a nerf. That said, I do have a sort of crackpot theory that what if Gambit Horseman of Death actually isn't that good? They seem to be pretty data-driven at Second Dinner when it comes to nerfs, and I think that if they were actually as reactive to community sentiment as the community likes to think that they are, they probably would have nerfed Gambit here, which to me suggests that maybe they have some data that suggests he's kind of mid, or that Mother Askani is a more important piece of those decks. Either way, I think Mother Askani is likely to be an archetypal card now, more close to Moon Girl than she was to Star-Lord. And she definitely was kind of the hidden Star-Lord of this metagame, where pretty clearly over the last 6 months of Marvel Snap, and I actually think you could go back a little bit further, there's been this increase in these powerful effects will come out, and duplicating them is just the best thing you can do. And when you duplicate them enough, it doesn't really matter what your location's positioning is. you just have numbers that are like so ridiculous. So the game becomes about you duplicating your stuff or your opponent stopping you from duplicating your stuff. And I think that play pattern is something that I particularly don't enjoy. A lot of people are sort of putting this all on Gambit's shoulders, and certainly he's not a very fun thing to have duplicated, but I think Mother Askani is a more important target here in the sense that these duplicators are and have been the problem even before Gambit released, and probably would be even if they deleted Gambit. That said, I still think Gambit could probably eat a nerf, and I would not complain about it. In fact, it would go pretty similar to how the segment on Supergiant is going to go. Supergiant is losing a point of power, and I have nothing bad to say about it whatsoever. I think maybe even Cerebro 5 decks will be celebrating this. Not to be the Cerebro commenter on every one of my videos, but it is actually kind of a relevant thing. Cerebro 5 did win my ban list tournament after all, and the ban list was targeted at Askani targets to some degree, so maybe there is something to be said for that. I will say that Supergiant getting a point of power taken off of it just feels like a pretty free thing to do. This is exactly how I'd feel about Gambit going to 3-4. Good job. Keep doing it. No issues here whatsoever. There might be people who say it's not Supergiant's fault. Maybe you should be looking at some of the other tech and Supergiant decks. Maybe you should be looking at Wilson Fisk. And while I think it's possible that if you wanted to take a bigger swing at the Supergiant archetype, you'd be taking a swing at Iron Patriot or taking a swing at Wilson Fisk or even something like Negasonic or Cosmo, I don't think those are nearly as viable targets for a nerf as Supergiant is. And I also think that a deck that is built on locking down certain priority things being in your favor, maybe you should have to play something that is like notably below rate to do that. I've got no issues with this one. Pretty much just a thumbs up from me. Feels like a change they could have made at any point in the last 6 months, and now they're making it, and I'm going to say exactly what I would have said at any point in the last 6 months. Good job. I have been a noted Luke Cage hater for approximately 3 years at this point. Luke Cage is a card that has bothered me from a design standpoint, and frankly, I sort of wonder if I would have even gotten the interest in design that I have were it not for constantly thinking about this guy and trying to dig deep into why I actually felt the way that I did about him. The biggest thing that bothers me about Luke Cage is that I think he restricts the future design space both of cards that interact with Afflict and of Afflict cards themselves. And I also think to a lesser degree this is true of Hazmat. And the reason for that is that they are all encompassing, right? If you are being afflicted by things, you play Luke Cage. If you want to afflict a bunch of things, you play Hazmat. Again, lesser extent, similar principle. I think that Luke Cage being what he is currently before this change, 3-2 afflicts don't happen, is the kind of thing that is not necessarily offensive because it's a tech card, but offensive because there's not anything else you can do in the space, right? He's retroactive. He comes down on turn 6. There's no time you can actually interact with him. Everything just gets undone in the entire game. Even a card like Mobius and Stardust that dictates the same way is going to be a card you actually have to play onto the board. And there's not really like any gameplay that happens around him. If you are playing an Afflict deck and you get Luke Caged, you just lose. There's not really anything you can do about it. Now, I will also say that I think the change they made to Luke Cage is a really smart one because it feels like a lateral-ish move in terms of power, while me adding some additional actual play into how this card plays out. They are taking a point of cost off of him. So he's going from 3-2 to 2-2, but now he's only protecting the front row. I think this is about as strong as they could have kept Luke Cage while not keeping him at 100%. Every time I dreamt up scenarios of how would we nerf Luke Cage, this was one of them that I came up with. I had a bunch of different things that I thought they could do to Luke Cage. Front row, back row, only this location, but they tried that and it didn't work. What about the other 2 locations? What about adjacent locations? I've thought about a lot of different things, but the basic principle of a Luke Cage nerf is you want to keep most of his power intact because he does do a nice, interesting thing when it's not encompassing 100% of the space of interacting with Affliction. I do think that this is a pretty interesting way to go about it because of all of the ways that you could change Luke Cage, this is to me the strongest possible text they could have done that still allows people to play Marvel Snap when they're playing an Afflict deck against Luke Cage. It's not even going to do that a lot of the time. This feels like they're keeping about 85% of Luke Cage's power, and they also made him cheaper. A lot of people are saying things like, oh, they buffed him because he's cheaper now. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that getting a 2/2 into your deck is actually still pretty difficult unless you're doing something specifically to synergize with it. Maybe you can play it in Aurora a little bit more. It's probably better in Afflict decks a little bit more. And maybe you're going to be able to do something like, I don't know, play it in an ongoing deck that's playing Spectrum. But I don't really think that your average deck is going to be incredibly happy about splashing this, or I should say more happy about splashing it than they were for a 3/2 Luke Cage. Any situation that would call for a 2/2 Luke Cage, I would have almost certainly rather been playing the 3/2 Luke Cage, because at least that one means that I win. And this one does not guarantee that at all. It just helps. And I do think that it might mostly mean that you win, but if I'm giving up a slot in my deck, I'm giving it up to make sure that I win a matchup, you know? And I think, it's very possible that Luke Cage is going to be pretty similar and mostly will win against anyone who's trying to do things like this, but I don't think that's guaranteed. And I also think the gap between 3/2 and 2/2, this might sound weird, I don't think it's as big as people think. I think playing a 2/2, it's obviously way better than playing a 3/2, but I do think that the gap it is a roughly equivalent gap in my head to the gap between his old ability and his new ability. And I do think that it's more about I'm already it doesn't matter what cost he's at. I'm playing something bad in this slot to win a specific matchup. I want it to always win that specific matchup, right? Because 2/2 is pretty far below the curve at this point. We have actively good 2/4s in the game. Invisible Woman is a 2/4. Cable is a 2/4. We have actively amazing 2/3s. Sam Wilson, even Angela's, that card is a 2/3. We have great cards that are bigger than this. So I think that he's far enough below par, even at 2, that while it is easier to get him in your deck, I'm not sure it's actually easier to justify the slot. Spider-Man 2099 strikes me as a bit of a here damn kind of change. He is going to a 4/5 with Moveable that when it moves, afflicts an opposing card with -3 power at the location that he moves to. So part of this seems to be that Aunt May needed a 4-cost Moveable, and I buy that. I do believe that Aunt May needed a 4-cost Moveable. I just wish that they'd been a little bit more ambitious on Spider-Man 2099. I think that he could have gotten a couple of extra points of power. I think that he could have gotten the text line Moveable twice. I think that he's roughly 2.5 points of power off. They could have made him a 4/7. They could have made him Moveable twice. I don't really know. I think either of those would have been much more exciting to me. My pitch, actually, when I've talked about this with some of my friends, is that the card they should have made a 4-cost Moveable is they should have just slapped Moveable onto Stegron, which I think is a pretty interesting thing to do, even if it's not necessarily thematic. I wish that this had maybe, giving -4, or maybe it was a little bit stronger, or maybe it had the ability to move twice. Really what I'm saying here is this card is underpowered enough that I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to be able to actually help the Aunt May decks, because it's just another bad card that you have to run to support Aunt May. And that is already the problem with those decks. If this card was good, that would be one thing, but it's just a 4-cost that says Moveable. Aunt May is getting a point of power. We talked about 2/4s that are actively good. Aunt May 2/4 this is a good card. The problem Aunt May has is not related to her stats, though. This is something that we talked about with Spider-Man 2099, where it's the problem is that you have to run a bunch of bad cards. And I guess the secondary problem is that her inputs require you taking the thing that is unique about those cards and sacrificing it for power. The point of movability is that you can reallocate your points on the final turn of the game. Aunt May is asking you to use that limited resource in exchange for some power. Right now, that resource, the best way to approach trying to build around this card is to play cards for whom that resource is not limited, namely Sam Wilson and to some extent Spider-Man Brand New Day. The problem with every other movable card is they're all movable once, except for Vision, who is going to come down on turn 5 and is movable once, functionally. That means that this is a card that is asking too much of you and not giving you enough. And changing it to 2/4 doesn't change that fundamental dynamic. Aunt May is a really cool card. I think she's awesome and interesting and kind of a really cool build around. The problem is that in order to play an Aunt May deck, you got to play 7 or so cards that are not cool, not interesting, not easy to build around. And if you're going to be in the movable space, why don't you just play Sam Wilson and Craven and Batroc instead? So the earliest you could possibly play Aunt May is actually going to be turn 4. Fundamentally, I don't think giving her a point of power changes that in any meaningful way. Her metagame dynamics will remain the same, and while I would like to believe that there is something to be said for maybe I'll play some Aunt May in my deck so I can get some big guys that don't guide a Gambit, I'm not really sure I buy it. I don't think this is necessarily bad. I want to be super clear about what I'm saying here. I'm coming from a competitive perspective, which is to say, I think that it is likely going to be suboptimal compared to the things that are the top end of the metagame. That's not to say it's bad or can't win or anything like that. This is going to be good. But there's a difference between a card that is good in a vacuum and a card that is good in context. And I don't think Aunt May has enough power in her package to be a card that is good enough to be one of the best decks in the metagame. Agent 13 getting a point of power, very much the same thing that I would say about Supergiant. Thumbs up. Good job. No further comments. I probably am not going to play Agent 13 in anything. I think in most decks, I would probably play Maria Hill long before I played Agent 13 because the more controlled output there is just generally going to be something I prefer. And of course, because typically when you are playing a deck that cares about created cards, Victoria Hand is involved, who wants cheaper created cards. Maria Hill guarantees me one of those. This could give me anything, including something I might not have the energy to play. I suspect that this will not change Agent 13 in any meaningful way. Weirdly, Lady Bullseye might be the card that is the most hurt by the changes that were made to this kind of Mother Askani deck. Lady Bullseye was a card that desperately wanted you to play multiple Mother Askanis on her, and that was the best thing you could do with her. I think that was pretty much the core of the like Wong, Askani, Ramatut, Lady Bullseye deck. People talked about it like it was a Ramatut deck, but the best thing you could do to win was almost always like a bunch of Lady Bullseyes. There was this one, and there was also the Warlock version of the deck, which might actually still survive, a deck that I think is actually pretty underrated generally, or would be if people weren't gambiting the crap out of you. I think this card is good, and I think that giving it an extra point of power means it is more actively good. This is a card that starts as a 2/5, scales to a 3/7, a 4/9, a 5/11, and a 6/13. I think that that is just going to be a solid thing to put in your deck a lot of the time. I see very little issue with just including that if you need a relevant stat stick at 2 or really at anywhere along the curve. I was already kind of a fan here, and I think I am probably a little bit bigger of a fan of Lady Bullseye than I previously was. And I think this is just losing the combo stuff, but getting compensated in terms of being a better just curve out card is something that is legit to me. Triton going up to 3/6, I'm fairly compelled by. I don't necessarily know what the future of Maverick decks looks like. I don't think it's necessarily going to look like Triton, but I think that in a world where they get a little more mid-rangey, a little less combo-y, playing a 3/6 is like non-zero really good for something that can buff a Maverick or a Captain Carter or something like that. I don't think this is a guarantee card that I'm going to be playing, but I also think that 3/6 card that beats Cerebro all of the time, again, you might not think that's the most relevant thing in the world, but it definitely could be the kind of thing that you go out of your way to include in your deck in the context of a tournament that might involve some Cerebros. I would actually be keeping an eye on this. Like, we did a ban list tournament. Cerebro was the finals. It was Cerebro 5 versus Cerebro 4. I did a video on it if you want to go check that out. This is the kind of thing where it's like, yes, the best decks in the game, Gambit, Captain Carter. First of all, they both run Mother Askani. Second of all, it's left it as sort of unclear as to like what's under them, right? What's the second best deck at doing points? We don't really know, because what's the point of knowing? Because it just loses to Captain Carter. But there's a very real chance it's a Cerebro deck. A very real chance. And having a card that's this good, that is just going to be able to be a tech card, this is kind of an insane stat line and insane amount of synergy, or possible synergy, for a tech card to have. It just kind of is. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.